Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the sixth issue of module number 4. And in today's rendition of Art History Fun, we're going to be looking at and exploring the artistic trends that began in the final third of the 19th century. Everyone's favorite calendar artists, we're looking at the Impressionists. And if there is a granddaddy of Impressionist calendar painters, my friend, you're looking at his youthfulness. This is Claude Monet, and an 1869 painting of his called La Grenouillère, or The Frog Pond. Now, in order to really tackle this painting, we need to talk a little bit about the artistic period that has come to be defined by him, Impressionism. Now, strictly speaking, Impressionism as an art historical movement is broadly defined by the years 1874 to 1886. And this was when a group of artists came together to exhibit together. The history has called those artists Impressionists, although it's really important to note that those artists don't really have a whole lot of things in common other than they all exhibited together. In a lot of ways, we can think of this as like maybe a high school art class or a college art class. We could call those art makers by any particular name because they're exhibiting together, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have any style that is easily discernible or binds them together. And this is very much true of the Impressionists. Although when we think about Impressionism, it's usually artists like Monet that we think of. More broadly, it is a bigger movement that comprises a number of different styles, although the style that Monet has is perhaps the most recognizable. In order to think about that style, we need to really understand where it comes from and how, when used, it was not exactly the most complimentary of terms. Um, I want you to imagine, if you will, that you want to be a baker. And I say this as someone who has taken a keen interest in baking bread. Let's say you want to be a baker. And let's say after practicing your trade of baking for a while, someone writes about you that you're not really a baker. You're only an impression of a baker. Well, that would hurt your feelings. And so too did it hurt the art makers who exhibited together, because the person who coined this phrase, Impressionism, essentially claimed that the art makers who were making them were not actually painters, but only impressions of painters. And this was not a nice thing to hear. So with that as a broad background, let's talk about this composition, because in a lot of ways, what Monet is trying to do is the same kind of thing that some of the art makers who came before him were trying to do. And if we were to think about some of those people, people like Monet, or pardon me, people like Courbet, here, we can think about the ways in which Gustave Courbet was attempting to show an exceedingly accurate rendition of common everyday life. He's a realist, and as such, he was trying to depict the things exactly as he saw them. Show me an angel, and I'll paint them. Well, the same is true for many of the Impressionists. What they're really trying to do is depict a remarkably accurate rendering of the world before them. And so, as a way of thinking about that, let me go ahead and show you a couple of details. So if we were to think about the upper detail here, this one right there, I think I pulled that detail from somewhere over here. And when you looked at the depiction of the whole painting of the left-hand side, I think you all understood that these horizontal bands of color, the light blues, the burnt oranges, the blacks, and the whites, what those were a depiction of water, the reflection of the water, and a rendition of the sky and the clouds in it. If I would have just shown you the detail with those horizontal bands of blue, white, orange, and black, I'm not sure you would have necessarily understood what you were looking at. But in doing this, Monet has somehow achieved or captured something visually true. You understand what it is, even though when it's taken out of context, you maybe don't. And so what Monet has done is captured a sense of vitality, a sense of truthfulness that you immediately understand in the wholer context, but maybe don't understand when it's separated from the whole. That is a really special thing. Now, if we were to think about Claude Monet's painting, and the frog pond is a really good example, and compare it with something that we've looked at before, and I'll bring it back to you, either The Burial at Ornat by Gustave Courbet or the same painters, the Stonebreakers. Both of these compositions were absolutely enormous. They're huge. I mean, The Burial at Ornat is probably 15 feet wide and 8 feet tall. This was a painting that took weeks, months to complete, rather than a matter of mere hours. But the Impressionists are working in a very, very different vein. They're going outside, they have their easel, they have their canvas, they have their palette and their paint and paintbrushes. And on Monday morning, this is what they paint. There is no sketch. This is the composition that they do. And in a lot of ways, this is different than most of the art makers who have come before us. The, the idea of sketching something had a really long tradition, and not just sketching that something, but doing large-scale color studies of it. I mean, this painting by Jacques-Louis David, The Oath of the Tennis Court, is a 5 foot by 3 foot fully realized color study. And this image on the right-hand side was a large-scale sketch for it. For the Impressionists, there was no sketch. What they did outside was the finished and final composition. And this was one of the things that most annoyed the art critics because they said, this is fine for a sketch. What's the final composition? And the Impressionists said, this is the final composition. They said, no, that's a sketch. You're not finished. They said, of course I'm finished. This is the final composition. So for the Impressionists, one of their primary goals was going outside, painting the middle class at leisure, and doing so with a great deal of quickness and spontaneity. And this was something that they did on a Monday morning. And the next day, they would do something different. There were no preparatory drawings, no sketches. They didn't take the drawings back into their studio to do large compositions. These paintings are 20 by 25. They're not enormous because you can't carry an 18-foot by 30-foot canvas outside. So the Impressionists are working quickly. They're often painting outside, and they're often painting the middle class at leisure. And if Monet is one branch of Impressionism, then Pierre-Auguste Renoir is a different one. This is his painting done the same time, the same place, the same subject. And you can see the ways in which two different painters, Monet and Renoir, both of them Impressionists, might think about a painting in very different kinds of ways. Renoir, for his part, although he exhibited with the Impressionist artists, was never a person who was able to let go his devotion to painting the human body. Human figures always actually look like human figures for Renoir, but for Monet, they might not. I mean, that kind of looks like a body, I suppose. I'm not much of a painter, but I think I could maybe cobble together this. But Renoir is a little bit different. He has a greater sense of exactitude, although they have the same interest in painting spontaneity and quickness. If there is a most famous Impressionist painting, this is it. This was considered the first one, although clearly Monet was working in an Impressionist style at least 3 years beforehand. This is called Impression Sunrise. It was done in 1872. It was part of the first Impressionistic show. And you can actually see that Monet has signed it and dated it in the bottom of the painting. Now, at first glance, this seems to be a jumbled hot mess, but once we begin to focus on it, slow down and look at it, we can begin to recognize a certain kind of visual truth that is there that is maybe hidden at first. Let me take a drink of water. Slow down. Look at it. Because you'll see here the sun rising over the bay of the Havre. You can see the reflection of that sun on the water. You can see the smokestacks bellowing forth fumes in the early morning atmosphere. You can see this skiff here with what is likely a man standing with his hand on the rudder. You can see these pulls of color horizontally across the water as a way of rendering highlights and shadows in an attempt to create a kind of wave-like motion. All of these things separated from the whole composition become somewhat unreadable. But when we look at them in the whole, they're instantly recognizable. This was the kind of thing that Monet did over the course of an hour, because what he was trying to do was render this scene exactly as it looks like now. One of the reasons why sunsets and sunrises are so fantastic is that they are in flux. They change, they're in movement over the course of 5 minutes. The light, the color, the vibrancy, the hue, the tone of it completely changes. And this is different throughout the day than what we experience through the day. I mean, the shadows might move between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock, but the sunlight is fundamentally the same. Monet is interested in capturing that sense of spontaneity, that unique moment in time. And in this way, I think the Impressionists are somewhat similar to our Baroque friends. If we go back to a lifetime ago and think about the Baroque movement, one of the things the Baroque artists were really interested in was capturing a sense of time. And this, my friends, this painting by Monet completely captures that sense of time. We know, because of the very nature of sunrises and sunsets, that this scene looks differently 15 minutes later. So although it has a sketchy appeal to it, one of the things that Monet has tried to do, he's been successful at, and that is give us a rendering of a unique moment in time. Indeed, time was one of the things that Monet was really interested in, but he was also interested in things like seasons. I mean, these are a couple of paintings that Monet completed of haystacks, and he does dozens of paintings of haystacks. And not because haystacks are necessarily interesting. Haystacks aren't. Instead, what haystacks are a kind of geometric shape that can be used as a vehicle for commenting on season of the year and the time of the day. You know, we live in a slightly different world where we maybe don't care as much about the light conditions and the seasons of the day, but 150 years ago, this was something of keen interest to the world. Monet is capturing that. What the sun looks like in the summertime is different than the wintertime, and this has everything to do with the axis of the Earth and where the sun rises and sets throughout each morning and evening. And Monet cares about that. This is a painting that Monet did of the cathedral at Rouen, which is a city in the northern part of France. The painting you're looking at here is from 1882, but he paints this work dozens of times over the course of several years. And you get the idea that the goal of this is not in the rendering of the cathedral, and the cathedral is, a decent example of the ornate Gothic style that was popular in the 14th century. But it's not really the building that Monet cares about. What he really cares about is what that building looks like over the course of a day. And so these paintings were all done in the 1880s, and I've tried to arrange them as they might have looked over the course of a single sunny day from the early afternoon until the evening time. Clearly, what Monet cares about is not the church. He cares about what the church looks like under differing lighting conditions. And in this, I believe that he was remarkably successful. Buildings look different at different times of day. The light changes, shadows change, and the Impressionist artists very broadly were interested in these unique moments in the time of day. They're after truth, a kind of visual truth, and in this regard, they are in some ways realists, just another step forward. When I was in my first like upper division art history class in college, it was a class on European modernism, and one of the exam questions, gosh, I took this class in like 1996, and I still remember it. And one of the questions was, is Impressionism the beginning of modernism or the end of realism? And what Dr. Moore was trying to get at is, how do you construct an argument that, in what way can we argue that Impressionism is the beginning of something new? And you can also argue that it is the beginning or the beginning of the end of an old thing. And I think that's really interesting. So I thought I'd give you another Monet painting to compare it with another Renoir painting. This is a picture of Boulevard de Capucines. It was done in 1873. It's a landscape, right? Like Monet is a landscapist. But this landscape is filled with people hustling and bustling about on what looks to be a relatively chilly winter day. Those are people, right? But they are um, they're people that have been painted with the most elementary of brushstrokes, the most lively and quickest of attempts, which is different than what Renoir does, right? There are many bridges that go across the Seine. The Pont Neuf is one of them, also from 1872. This is Renoir's Pont Neuf. And you can see when compared side by side how different these look. They're both a painting of the Parisian landscape, right? Like this is the city writ large with people and trees and bridges and buildings. But Renoir cares about the people. He always cares about the people. And when we think about some of his more famous compositions, and this is a great example of that, we can see how daring he is from a compositional point of view. This is his 1876 masterpiece, The Moulin de la Galette. And we'll talk a little bit about the title, although when I was in the Musée d'Orsay a couple years ago, I saw a person walking around with a rubber chicken, and I thought this was a worthwhile picture. So I know you were hoping to see a rubber chicken today. Here you go. The Let's talk about the title, La Moulin de la Galette. A moulin is a windmill, right? If you've seen the movie The Moulin Rouge, rouge, kind of like bâton rouge, red stick. Moulin Rouge is the red windmill, and un galette is a kind of pancake. So this is the windmill of the pancake. It was an outdoor like dining establishment. And in this composition, we have, if nothing else, the middle class at leisure. They're socializing, they're eating, they're drinking, they're dancing, they're telling stories, they're having a general good time. And the middle class at leisure became one of the calling card subjects of the Impressionistic painters because the people that the Impressionists were hoping to sell paintings to were, wait for it, the middle class, who had discretionary income to buy things like this. And so artists like Renoir were hoping to sell paintings to people like, forgive me. This isn't enormous. This is, maybe 40 by 30. This is the kind of painting that I could afford for an art major who was painting today, right? Like if this was a painting in a student at Louisiana Tech senior show, they could probably sell this for $1,500, and that would be a pretty healthy sum for them. And that's the kind of thing that like a college professor could pay for. Now, if we think about this from a compositional point of view, and we look at the painting here on the left, think about this poor lad or lass, I can't tell. Like here, they've been cut off. Like these people over here have been cut off. His shoulder has been cut off. There is a kind of photographic spontaneity about this that is very different than what we are accustomed to. In a lot of ways, we can think about it like maybe the difference between Leonardo's Last Supper, which was composed, balanced, symmetrical, and then that of Tintoretto's, which was almost a photographic snapshot. That is what is happening here. And I think the same is true in here in The Boating Party from just a couple of years later, has the same subject, the middle class at leisure, but it also has that same kind of compositional daring. People looking away from the viewer, their backs to us, not paying attention to us, cut off on the side of the picture plane. I mean, this seems like a silly point, but no Renaissance artist would ever dream of cutting off someone's elbow. Like that would hurt Raphael's feelings. But it's the kind of thing that Renoir does not think twice of. If Renoir liked to do portraits, he loved painting people and he liked doing outdoor scenes. Edgar Degas has a couple of infatuations, some of them healthy, some of them not. One, he loves horse races. And so during the 1870s and during the 1880s, there were a number of racetracks on the outskirts of Paris, and this would be the kind of thing that the middle class would do. They'd rent a carriage, go out to Argenteuil or the outskirts of Paris, places like Pontoise, and they would watch horse races. That's what's happening here. Both of these are compositions that somehow do with the middle class leaving Paris to go do something fun for the afternoon. Get out to nature, see some grass and trees, fresh air. So Degas does this kind of thing, but he also does depictions of pre-adolescent girls wearing tutus. And the ballet rehearsal and the dancing class are really great examples of this. One from 73, the other from 1874. These were both part of the Impressionistic shows. And let's focus our attention first um, on the ballet rehearsal from 1874. If we were to think about this composition and put like a push pin in the direct center of it, I think we might be able to agree that it's say somewhere like right here. So I'll leave my little cursor guide there. Middle. So let's divide this painting into quadrants. The upper quadrant, upper left is quadrant 1, and then going clockwise, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, quadrant 4. Okay, so let's talk about those quadrants individually. Quadrant 1, if we just look at that quadrant, has half of a stairwell and some ballerinas. Quadrant 2 has some upper bodies and heads, and then the dancing person in red. Quadrant 3 is nothing but legs. Quadrant 4 is nothing but floorboards and the first part of the stairwell. I mean, I think it's fair to say, if nothing else, that this is a remarkably unbalanced composition. Like our eye doesn't really know where to go. It's kind of heartbreaking in some ways. Like somewhere our artists who did perspective are rolling over in their graves, crying and throwing dirt because there's no vanishing point, there's no compositional focus, there's no place for our eye necessarily to go, and that would all be okay if Degas had just cared a little bit about constructing perspectival space. Like even if he didn't have a vanishing point or like a place for our eye to go, at least do space well. But if we were to put an imaginary marble, just right here, don't you get the idea that marble trickles down? the space has been tilted up in a way that just makes us a little bit uneasy. And that's a little bit concerning to us. And I think the same can be said here for the dancing class on the right-hand side. Same quadrant system, my friends. If we put our middle, maybe right about there, right about her little footsie, a whole quarter of the composition is the old man's leg, his tapping stick, and floorboards. And although the floorboards all kind of have this kind of recession back, I mean, they all seem to be curving, don't they? You get the idea that if there is a vanishing point, it's up here somewhere. But even that cannot save the marble from rolling towards us as a viewer. Like, this is nothing if not perspectively unbalanced. Degas, like Renoir, like Monet, is painting quickly. These are rapid works done in the course of a day at the most too, but these are not labored over in the ways in which, David individually drew the bodies and then painted clothing on the male form later. This is a very different attempt. But it's also very different than the kinds of things that Gustave Caillebotte was doing at exactly the same time. These are both paintings by Gustave Caillebotte, Paris Street, Rainy Weather on the left, and the Pointer Up from the previous year. And these paintings, I think it's fair to say, have a remarkable sense of perspective to them. These were not painted quickly, these were labored over. They're also bigger than most of the Impressionistic paintings. And although Caillebotte's paintings look very different than the kinds of things that Monet was doing, I'll go back. Ready? Monet, Caillebotte, they're both Impressionists because they were both part of the same series of shows. And so if we were to think about this composition, the one on the left-hand side, which is just dazzling, you can see that he has created a sense of perspective, a sense of balance. We have not one vanishing point, but two. He's using a two-point system. So this building, we could draw an orthogonal from this and there to a vanishing point over here and another here down this street. It's a meticulously painted umbrella. Our middle class walking out in public. And just some details to show you some of the real oomph that Caillebotte is working on. You can see the perspective here. I mean, even just beautiful wagon wheels from the carriage, I should say, carriage wheels. The man wearing a three-piece suit, a stovepipe top hat, the woman with a hat on, like a kind of a veil over her face. The attention to detail of the bridge, not the bridge, I beg your pardon, the building itself, the umbrella, the people in the background. And I'll give you just a really lovely passage here. This is where he signed it in the lower right-hand corner, but look at the cobblestones. And just the pull of light color between the cobblestones very much gives you the idea of the water that reflects the daytime sky above it. I mean, it's just a really, really lovely passage, and I think that's quite remarkable. And some of the same kinds of things can be seen here in Caillebotte's painting here of a bridge. We have a dog receding away from us, this beautiful banister overlooking the bridge over top of the River Seine, and what looks to be a similar man walking towards us, same kind of coat, same waistcoat and tie. A woman with a similar kind of dress without the ruffles over on the left-hand side, on a sunny day taking a promenade in the Parisian day. So all of that is really, really lovely. Edouard Manet, who we've met before when we looked at things like The Luncheon and the Grass and Olympia, just to remind you. Here they are. Manet goes through a variety of different styles. And although we think of the Bar at the Folies Bergère as being a kind of impressionistic painting, it's important to bear out that he never viewed or exhibited with the Impressionists. And so, although this is impressionistic in style, It is not impressionistic by artists because Manet never exhibited with them. But this is a really complicated composition, and at first you have to fight through it to understand it. Although one of the things I can tell you is that one of the first registered trademarks was the trademark for Bass Pale Ale. And here's a bottle of Bass Pale Ale. How about that? So we are to look at this composition. We have this woman who's standing before us, and I think it's fair to say she is bored out of her skull. She stands at a bar serving drinks, and there's a mirror here that is offset. So we get the idea that this is her. The mirror is not perfectly parallel to us, and there's a man standing in front of her. This makes us him. So he is at the bar waiting for a drink. And this is the reflection behind us, the viewer, and it's people at the club having a good time, drinking, partying, socializing, and you get the idea that you and I are having the fun that she wishes she could have. The closer you look at this, though, the more things become a bit confusing. For example, do you see the green shoes? There, that hanging from the ceiling is a person on a trapeze with some like emerald slippers. So this is like a performance of some kind. And again, the Impressionists at play. It was during the 1870s and 80s when we begin to see a large influx of Americans coming to Europe to paint, and Mary Cassatt is one of them. She's from a well-to-do family in Philadelphia. And in 1874, I believe, after completing her studies, she packs up and moves to Paris, where she becomes enormously popular. And one of the things that she does that the Impressionist artists are gonna do quite frequently is the idea of painting pattern. Now, I haven't talked about this before, but one of the things that the Impressionist artists are keenly interested in is the sudden influx of Chinese and Japanese artistic elements into the Western art world. Um, the French phrase for this is Chaniserie or Japisme, and it literally means Japanese or Chinese aesthetics that get kind of hijacked and appropriated by Western artists. Now, it's important to note that the depiction of space was something that was really foundational within the Western art worlds. I mean, if you come to college and you're an art major, you're going to learn perspective your first semester. It gets foundational to what we do in art. But this is not the same everywhere. It's one of the reasons why Degas' paintings look the way they do. He probably can do perspective, he just doesn't care. And so this is very true with Cassatt's painting here. Certainly there's an incredible interest in things like um, balance and pattern, like the fabric, the tartan across her waist. And I think the same is true here of these images, both of them depicting women, which is something that Cassatt did quite frequently, of the idea of pattern and flatness of space, and often depictions of women in public or women embracing motherhood. These are some of the things that Mary Cassatt does quite frequently. And and just to remind you of some of the things that we've talked about in this class, I mean, I give you um, Masaccio's Holy Trinity and Robert Campon's The Center Panel of the Marode Altarpiece. They're done about the same time, 1428. But the image on the left is all about perspective, and the image on the right, it's just not that important. The image on the left was one that had informed art makers in the West for a really, really long time. Good artists rendered three-dimensional space. But in other parts of the world, this was less important. And Ando Hiroshige, was one of those art makers from a different artistic tradition, and it was just not that important. Now, this is what's called a ukiyo-e print. It's a relatively cheap woodblock print. These were affordable to almost anybody in Japan during the middle part of the 19th century. When we look at this, there's a sense of flatness about it. There's not a real rendering of three-dimensional space. We don't have atmospheric perspective, goodness knows. There's no vanishing point. There's certainly an interest in pattern. This idea became something that the Impressionists and the post-Impressionist artists who follow are absolutely going to mimic. When we look at these two, this wood block on the left and the painting on the right, and I think you can see a kind of visual relationship with these two images. And this relationship will become increasingly important as the 1880s go along. Now, Cassatt is painting a little bit later than that, but there are all kinds of artists around 1470 who are going to be looking at prints like this, and it's going to inspire them to try something new, to step out of their box, to push their boundaries. And I'll give you this just as a way to get there. This is a painting by a Dutch artist you might have heard of before named Vincent van Gogh. And if you need a better example of the ways in which Eastern artistic influences are impacting Western artists during the final quarter of the 19th century, if you need a better example, then I don't know what you're looking for, because this is ding, 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 winner. This is Van Gogh finding a Japanese woodblock print and making it his own. And this idea will be something that will very much occupy us when we return for our seventh module, that which will explore Impressionism. That's where we pick up next time.